Hello, and welcome to our Macbeth podcast, the topic of which today is evil in Macbeth.
We're joined today by Miss Earnshaw.
Hello.
Mr. Waters.
Hello.
Miss Pipes.
Hello.
And Miss Lyford.
Hello.
Should we start off by talking about what evil is?
I think we should, because we
Okay.
kind of need to, if we're answering an exam question about evil, we need to show that we have that awareness, don't we?
It's good for AO3 and for AO1.
Mr. Waters, what do you think evil is?
So I think in its most typical sense, evil is considered something that's kind of immoral or wicked, kind of doing things that we might frown upon as harming somebody or causing, problems or issues for other people, potentially. But obviously there are a lot of other different interpretations of that word as well.
What do you think, Miss Pipes?
I agree with Mr. Waters. However, I think that evil is quite often connected with some sort of supernatural force as well, and that's certainly seen in Macbeth. We see the evil that's presented very much motivated by supernatural forces in the play. But also, more specifically, in this play, it seems to be connected with the idea of a lack of guilt or remorse. A lot of the characters who are seen as evil don't, at some point in the play, have an understanding of the consequences of that and therefore don't show a lot of remorse for their actions.
We were talking as well, weren't we, about how a lot of the evil characters in Macbeth don't necessarily conform to what we expect to be typically good or what we expect from them in their position, whether that's as a woman or as a king or, whatever else. So quite often we're looking at atypical characters when we're looking at evil characters.
I suppose that's a good point to start looking at the characters we might connect with the theme of evil then in Macbeth. No surprise that we could start with Macbeth himself.
Yeah, definitely.
I think a lot of people would say Lady Macbeth comes second.
Naming
or
no names.
maybe
Mr. Waters.
Mr. Waters definitely wants to talk
I
about
really
Lady
like
Macbeth.
Lady Macbeth. I think she's a very interesting character.
She is,
for a
yeah.
number of reasons. Mostly because she's evil.
I think you could argue in some way that the witches are more evil, though, especially because they're the ones who motivate a lot of the evil actions within the play. They understand something about Macbeth and his inherent ambition, and that their understanding of that causes a lot of his evil actions.
Because I was going to say, if we were to go even further than characters, I would say ambition in itself is, I view it as a driving force for evil in the play.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I think that kind of contrasts as well with whether you think Macbeth is in control of his own actions or whether it's kind of something pushed by fate, and I guess that would link to the witches as well. Are the witches in control of what they do, or are they just a vehicle for which fate can kind of, or through which fate can act, in a sense?
I think it's important, isn't it, to track how evil's introduced, so we get it right from that first scene with the witches, and then obviously it's introduced to Macbeth in Act 1, Scene 3. As soon as we meet Lady Macbeth as well, we get her kind of evil soliloquy. I don't know if that's what you'd call it.
Well, she's kind of pleading to be filled with, she says cruelty, but could we argue it's evil?
Yeah.
She calls upon the spirits to fill her with the capacity for evil.
And we
And
see
to
that very
remove-
much immediate reaction to Macbeth's letter, that she knows what she wants him to do. She wants him to harness his ambition to be and then therefore be evil by killing King Duncan, and that's her definite intention, isn't it?
I suppose it's his as well. You mentioned Act 1, Scene 3, he mentions murder as soon as the
Yeah.
witches give their prophecies, so was that always within him?
And is there any acts that Lady Macbeth or Macbeth commit from that point forward that wouldn't be considered evil? I would argue maybe not.
And I certainly
Just a lot of killing people.
Yeah. A downward spiral of evil.
Although I guess if we're arguing that, lack of guilt or remorse is one of the things that makes us evil, does Lady Macbeth redeem herself by the end by feeling what she's done?
Whereas Macbeth doesn't really.
But
he just
does.
says she should have died hereafter. Spoiler alert for a quote that we'll talk about later.
And also for what happens at the end of the play, which hopefully you already know.
Yeah, I really hope that
By this, if you're listening to this podcast and you haven't yet read Macbeth, go back and do that first.
Get reading Act 1, Scene 7 and Act 2, Scene 2, the murder scenes.
Yeah, they're the good ones.
murder.
Yeah.
So, shall we look at some quotes then?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, good. Cool.
Okay, good.
Excellent. Who wants to start off then? Does anyone have a favourite evil quote that they'd like to look at first?
I think there's a logical one to look at this, because of the way that the witches are presented as this evil force straight away. And
Or they set some kind of tone for the rest of the play that then develops into that.
Even just
spiral
by
of
their
evil.
setting, the
Yeah.
very first setting of the first scene that we're introduced to, it's the witches, but there's the pathetic fallacy of the thunder, and they're on the heath, which is traditionally associated with like the supernatural and the
Bad
kind of
things.
evil. Yeah, bad things.
Yeah, so the way that they chant fair is foul and foul is fair, straight away you get that kind of sense of perhaps the chaos that
Yeah.
is going to ensue, I think, because of the difference between the words fair and foul there. I don't know what you take from that quote, how you interpret it, because I know the way that we see it as a modern audience might be a little bit different to how it would have been seen at the time, because I think we understand the idea of fairness quite differently to a Renaissance audience, don't we?
Yeah, I was thinking the first idea it gave me when you mentioned it was linked to what we talked about in our definition of evil, where we were saying the absence or not conforming to what's good. And it's as though goodness has become muddied or made bad. My vocabulary is not very good today.
Almost like that confusion.
And the foulness that's all around.
I think the way they say it as well, that kind of incantation, the stagecraft used there is tying into that idea of supernatural being evil, but then also this lack of conformity to what we kind of see as good or moral.
Yeah, and how that can therefore impact on all the characters and their actions.
And I guess the oxymoron in there as well just kind of suggests right from the start that anything goes in this play. You know, the good characters can become evil, the evil characters can become good. There's, that chaos, like you said, isn't there, right from the start?
Yeah, and I think it's really important that Macbeth's first line in the play is so fair and foul and fair a day I have not seen, because it creates that connection between him and the witches, and you really see that you kind of get this indicator that he's been picked on purpose because he's very ambitious. I think the witches see something in him, don't they? And perhaps they see his potential for evil.
And the way that language is repeated in Macbeth dialogue, it's like he's been influenced by the supernatural even before he meets the witches.
Yeah, potentially it's not even just a connection between him and the witches, but actually a connection between him and that idea of good can become evil. And then where we see him at the start as this kind of revered, respected soldier.
Maybe that Macbeth.
Exactly, maybe that kind of foreshadows his descent into evil or tyranny. Just quoting.
Just quoting.
And I
Always good to
suppose what I think it was you, Miss Earnshaw, that said before about very much connecting ambition to evil, when he says, open quotation marks, I have no spurs to prick the sides of my intent, only vaulting ambition, close quotation marks.
Yeah, so obviously we're skipping to quite a bit later in the play there, but I think it's where we fully see the impact of everything that's followed the opening of the play and that foulness seeping into everything that's influenced Macbeth, whether it's the witches, the supernatural, Lady Macbeth, or ultimately ambition. He's debating whether or not to commit that tragic error of killing King Duncan. And ultimately here, the way I interpret these lines is the character has no reason whatsoever to kill King Duncan apart from ambition. No reason to commit an evil act apart from his own desire for power.
Yeah, and it's vaulting ambition as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Ambition that overcomes everything else in his life.
It's
that he
limitless,
has.
so we can... Obviously, there's lots of meanings to vaulting, but isn't it connected to the ceilings of cathedrals or churches? It's almost as if it's limitless.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But I think post that point, that's very much a turning point for him, isn't it? That scene where he makes the decision that he is going to kill Duncan, and then he kind of goes on and it snowballs from there. So we get the quote later in the play, I am in blood stepped in too far. So blood being this motif that really runs all the way through the play, but very much kind of symbolises that evil or symbolises that kind of immoral action that they take.
Yeah, and we said earlier that we thought that in the play evil was an important idea in relation to how much remorse characters feel, and I think the blood aspect definitely shows how guilty they feel, and we see that definite contrast between Macbeth's instant guilt with Lady Macbeth feeling very able to continue and not allow guilt to take over, and then they react very differently as the play goes on, don't they?
But then they
It's
switch,
true.
don't they? They have like the role reversal.
Yeah, and I think maybe this metaphor is key in that we obviously get this sense that he's feeling this overwhelming guilt. He's literally stepped into blood, into his evil deeds up to I don't know, what should we say? Waste time?
Waste
Yeah.
time.
But it says he can wade
Pretty
no he can wade no more. It's as if he can go no further. He can only stay as this person he's become, arguably evil.
Do you think that's why he almost then has to accept that he's evil, and he doesn't seem to feel as guilty as it goes on, because
Yeah.
it's almost this acceptance that he's committed the ultimate evil deed of killing a
Yes.
king, and there's no way back from that.
Yeah.
Should we talk about Lady Macbeth then? How
Yeah.
she presents
Yeah.
her evil? Because I think there's some similarities, isn't there? There's still
Definitely, yeah.
that kind of blood motif that runs alongside her, but I think she's maybe more overtly evil in the language that she uses.
I think certainly when, I hope it's the same with all of you, but when we have discussions in class, I know lots of people immediately say that she, I don't know, is to blame for events in the play, or might be labelled the most evil character.
But her evil's different, isn't it? In that it's not that kind of physical committing the crime yourself,
No.
but it's almost the manipulation and the kind of underlying evil that spurs Macbeth on, much like the witches, I guess, in the start of the
And actually
play.
her language in that first that Act 1 scene 5 that we see her in, fill me from the crown to the toe, full of direst cruelty, and come ye spirits, that kind of imagery, supernatural imagery, very much I think reflects or kind of links to the language that the witches use.
Yeah, and just the commands there as well, the fact that she feels in control of something that would have been considered at the time so evil and would have been kind of a source of fear for Jacobean audiences, potentially.
I think, though, it's important to consider the fact that she's not naturally full of this direst cruelty. She's commanding the spirits to fill her with it. She doesn't already possess this, if we're going to take it to mean evil. It's supernaturally channeled into her.
Do you think it's because she sees it as a way to gain power?
Yeah.
Because she doesn't use the word head to the toe, she uses crown.
Yeah.
So it's almost as though she thinks that if she is filled with cruelty, that will be the way that she is going to
Yeah.
achieve her status as queen,
Yeah.
and allow Macbeth to achieve his ambition as well.
Or do you think
think
it's
that's
because
very
she's a
true.
woman? Because she talks about how this idea, sorry, I know you're all women, but she talks about this idea, doesn't she, that
Thanks, Mr. Wallace.
she talks about this idea that she can't commit the evil herself because of her gender, and this
Yes.
idea that she wants so is there the idea in the play that only men are capable of the ultimate evil, and she wishes she could, but ultimately the only thing she's capable of is the manipulation and the pushing him into it.
I think Shakespeare does kind of push you in looking at Macbeth and Lady Macbeth to consider as an audience whether it's committing evil acts that makes someone ultimately evil, or whether it's just having an involvement or persuading someone to commit evil acts that makes someone ultimately evil. Talking about persuasion, what about Act 1, Scene 7?
What about it?
What about it? Well, it's the one everyone knows.
Yeah.
Pretty key scene.
It's a key scene. Probably quotes that should be familiar to Year 11 and other year groups. She talks about that she would have dashed the brains out of a child, and she asks to take my milk for gall, gall being poison.
Yeah.
So again, the imperatives there, the commands that she uses, quite kind of strong, but also the violence and the kind of the shock factor, I would say.
And particularly the imagery there linked to maternal kind of instincts as well, replace my milk, the thing that she'd used to sustain her children, with poison, or killing a child. There's almost that removal of something that maybe Jacobean audiences would have viewed as inherently good, that idea of motherhood. So this idea that you're removing what makes somebody, or what makes a woman in particular, good in this society.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting again though that here she's not necessarily saying these things because she intends to do them herself.
Yeah.
She's using them as a way to persuade Macbeth to
Yeah.
commit the evil
I
deeds.
that's
would
really
have done
important.
these
Yeah.
things.
Is that the same scene as Be the Serpent Under the Rose as well? Because that's another way in which she manipulates Macbeth, isn't
Act
it?
like the innocent flower.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The serpent
serpent
under it.
underneath.
Yeah.
I think it's how she's trying to ensure he can keep his courage to the sticking place and make sure that he continues to feel ambitious and therefore commit what she thinks is the correct act in her eyes.
Because he's almost chickened out at this point, hasn't
Yeah.
he? He's
Yeah.
almost said, oh no, we will proceed no further in this business.
Yeah. her language here, then, Shakespeare makes it this extreme version of violent intent and evil. Do you think that makes her evil, just the fact that her language hints so strongly at it?
I think this idea of someone believing they could do that to their own child, and the kind of the thought behind what she says makes her seem evil.
Even being
doesn't
capable of thinking of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's contrasted with Lady Macduff as well, isn't it, later on in the play, who you see as a very maternal figure, and that you've got that kind of contrast in terms of maternal Lady Macduff compared to Lady Macbeth, and I think that kind of enhances her evil qualities in a sense.
We were talking earlier, weren't we, in terms of developing analysis, developing your AO2 marks, how you could look at characters or events that could be considered evil or influenced by evil, and you could contrast them or consider how they're contrasted in the play with characters or things that are good. So Lady Macduff,
Macduff
himself, Banquo, because
Banquo
obviously
refusing to be kind of tempted by the supernatural, or being tempted but in a very different way, I think, isn't he?
Because they're together obviously when they receive the witch's prophecies, but react to it in very different ways.
Because as you mentioned earlier, that Macbeth's instant thought of murder when he hears the prophecies, but Banquo understanding these witches as the instruments of darkness, I think shows that they see their influence very differently, don't they?
And then you've got, obviously, Duncan and Malcolm as the good king, which contrast with Macbeth's portrayal of the tyrant, the evil king, which, again, is another one of those foils, those contrasts between characters.
I think the only thing you could say there is, I think Shakespeare is almost suggesting that someone can be too good. With
Duncan.
With Banquo, really. I think... I don't think Duncan is seen as a perfect king, is he? I think, in some ways, Malcolm is seen as is having the potential to be a more effective king than Duncan, because he isn't quite as naive and quite as trusting as...
it's almost as if Duncan receives the warning at the beginning, having one thane betray him, that the same thing could happen with Macbeth, but he doesn't take that warning.
He's quite naive, isn't he, in a sense, Duncan?
Yeah, so there's almost a suggestion there that someone could be too good.
But there's an evil of being too good, almost.
But I think obviously we are meant to see certain characters much more favourably because of their good actions.
Should we look at the consequences then for predominantly Macbeth and Lady Macbeth of their evil, and how that kind of plays out towards the end of the play?
I think that'd be definitely a nice thing to put into an answer, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
To think about why they're evil, how that's shown, perhaps how they're contrasted with other characters, and then ultimately for Lady Macbeth and Macbeth what the consequences of that evil is.
Because I think you can then look quite nicely at writers' purpose, can't you, at what Shakespeare is trying to show his audience or teach his audience about evil. Macbeth or Lady Macbeth first?
Let's go with Macbeth. We've not talked about him for a while.
That's surprising from you. You're such a Lady Macbeth
I do love
fan.
Lady Macbeth.
I was, to play devil's advocate, no, that's not the right word. Anyway,
I think it is.
I was going to say Lady Macbeth because, again, it comes first chronologically, like you said,
Okay.
when we were choosing our evidence to begin with.
Yeah, the consequences of it.
Go on then, I'm outvoted.
Okay.
Act 5, Scene 1.
Yeah.
The sleepwalking scene.
A
We
fave.
see
A classic.
A classic. I like talking about the stagecraft for that scene, and the fact that we're in her bedroom. Often when you look at different performances, she's kind of dressed in a nightgown, or actually I think there is one where she's completely naked, but certainly she's set up to look on stage much more vulnerable than she has done previously in the play.
That's interesting.
This should be a private space, shouldn't it? Where
We're watching alongside the doctor and her kind of, I don't know what you'd call, like,
The
servant,
nurse.
do you think it's because we're witness now to her private thoughts she can no longer control?
Yeah.
I think in Shakespeare's plays, nightwear was linked to vulnerability as well,
And
wasn't
so
it?
is sleep, isn't it? You know, Duncan murdered while he's asleep. Sleep is a symbol of the
And
innocent or
Macbeth
the
hath
vulnerable.
murdered Sleep after he kills Duncan, so that kind of
Sleep
tied
is
into
peace.
guilt.
Yeah.
Sleep is peace. She's not sleeping
But not for
restfully.
her. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think the kind of the things that run throughout the play linked to these kind of ideas about connections to evil and the consequences of evil seem to be blood that we've talked about, sleep and water as well, isn't it? So that they become important in this scene, because Lady Macbeth says out damn spot, and she is very much unlike her reaction straight after Duncan's murder, can't get rid of the image of blood and the consequences of the evil that she's committed with Macbeth. And she's changed quite drastically, hasn't she, in comparison to earlier on in the play?
Yeah, because she's saying similar things, isn't she?
She's still commanding,
Yeah.
isn't she? But she's not getting what she wants anymore.
No, you can see she's powerless to rid herself of these spots, which are no longer literal spots of blood, but are symbolic of her guilt, as we've discussed before.
I think Lady Macbeth seems to see blood very literally earlier on in the play, when she says a little water cleanses of this deed, whereas at this point, perhaps a bit more like Macbeth did earlier on, we get this idea of it becoming more of a symbol of her guilt.
All the perfumes of Arabia cannot sweeten this little hand.
This little hand.
I think that's a nice...
Are we sympathising with Lady Macbeth?
I sympathise with her by the end. Or I pity her,
Yeah.
if sympathy's not the right word.
I think it's interesting as well, just the way that her language changes, you know, and if you're wanting to talk about form of the play, the way she goes from that kind of controlled meter earlier on in the play, the iambic pentameter, to in Act 5, she's not speaking in that anymore, is she? She's speaking in very kind of prose-like language. It's not as controlled, she's not as controlled in what she says anymore, which I guess links to what you were saying about her power having diminished.
I think it's harder to necessarily track a certain scene to show the consequences of evil for Macbeth, maybe. I think we see glimpses of the guilt and the remorse throughout the play, really. So immediately after he kills Duncan, you know, he says, Macbeth hath murdered sleep, and, you know, I cannot say amen, and all of those kind of things.
Yeah.
I think one way that it's really evident is the way that other characters treat him and refer to him, because you've got obviously that very opening, or one of the opening scenes in which they're kind of talking about brave Macbeth, who's kind of fought for Scotland and won, and by the end pretty much every character refers to him as the tyrant. You know,
Or
he
the
doesn't
butcher.
even have a name.
But it's almost like their perspective has changed, because even in that early scene, what's the...
Unseamed him from the nave
He's
to the chops.
unseamed him from the nave to the chops. He could still be seen as a butcher there, right from the start. It's just that people view him as a brave
Because
warrior.
he wasn't butchering them.
Yes.
It's the right killing, isn't it?
Yeah,
in
but
their
now
eyes?
he's having this impact upon the country. You were talking earlier about...
Almost the country itself is described as having a wound, isn't it? As though Shakespeare's presenting Macbeth very poor leadership and the tyranny that by which he's controlling Scotland, and that having a literal effect. There's the description, isn't there, of almost people being without sleep and without food, as though their basic needs are not even being met because of the way that Macbeth's evil is having an impact on everyone and all of his subjects in Scotland.
So he's butchering Scotland.
Yeah.
If the country is repeatedly bleeding. Is it Malcolm that's using that metaphor? Is it Macduff?
It's one of them.
It's
one of those.
We should check.
Yeah.
Um,
And then obviously there's the consequences as well for Macbeth in terms of his hallucinations and his or arguably, you know, actually seeing the ghost of Banquo at the feast. Whether that's hallucination or whether that's real is obviously down to interpretation. But
Do you
I
think
think
that's him seeing evidence of his own evil?
Yeah, I think you could argue that. I think he has a more personal consequences in Lady Macbeth's death. This kind of unplanned from their part death that they have to suffer, so she should have died hereafter.
does he care at that point?
I think he momentarily does until he's distracted by
Yeah, I don't know
the
if
trees
it's
moving and all of that kind of
probably
thing.
influenced by productions I've seen where it's in that scene where he's preparing for battle, isn't he?
Yeah.
And the only thing that causes him to pause is hearing of his wife's death. She should have died hereafter. Like, this shouldn't have happened now.
I think you could argue in that moment though, he almost sees it as an inconvenience to what he's almost like he can't deal with the emotions of that moment because he's got this bigger battle on his hands, hasn't he?
As a Lady Macbeth fan, do you think, Mr. Waters, that she should have had a better exit from the play?
I think it almost sums up her insignificance by the end of the play. And if we're talking about
Yeah.
consequences, that's another one, isn't it? That, you know, she's almost at the forefront of the play in the first 2 acts, but by the end of it,
She's
yeah,
sidelined.
exactly. She's sidelined. She's not important anymore, potentially because of the consequences of her actions. She's not viewed as meaning anything or having any influence anymore. And that's almost as if to say the women who are manipulative will lose their influence or lose their power because they'll be sidelined,
Yeah.
potentially.
Is it just women though? Because we've said we see the consequences by the end of the play. What is it that makes characters who've been involved in evil in some way in Macbeth face the ends that they do? Is it that they've committed evil deeds? Is it their ambition? Is it the way they've gone about things?
Is it just upsetting the natural order of things,
Yeah,
you could argue,
I think
both
so.
in how Lady Macbeth upsets the natural order of what makes a woman, but also Macbeth obviously upsetting the natural order of the monarchy and power and Scotland.
Yeah.
And that ultimately is restored, isn't it, by the end of the play? So does Shakespeare want us to think that when those kind of things happen and evil is the root of those things happening, that it's kind of fate or whatever it is will always restore things to how they are?
What I was going to say was maybe it's anybody who gives in to supernatural forces, because you don't see the witches particularly affected by the evil that they've kind of the way that they've influenced evil. Obviously they have to restore order.
They get a bit of a telling off.
They get a bit of a
That's it.
telling off, but they can carry on having their fun, can't they, afterwards?
I guess one last consequence as well is if you just think about, you know, Malcolm delivering the final lines of the play, is the idea of the legacy, the way Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are remembered as well by their countrymen. I think the last way they're referred to is the tyrant and his butcher queen or something along those lines. So that idea of your legacy potentially not being remembered as somebody who was good for your country, but actually people who harmed it and intentionally harmed it.
Yeah.
Especially as Macbeth has such a positive reputation at the start of the play, and that's completely stripped, isn't it?
And that's his
by the
character,
end?
isn't it? As the tragic hero, the downfall from the start to the end.
Is that how we can conclude then that no matter what drives characters to commit evil actions or have evil thoughts or go through with evil deeds, they will suffer that tragic downfall and ultimately order will be restored somehow?
I think that's the point, isn't it? That evil will never triumph by the end of this play, and indeed it doesn't.
Fantastic. Well, that concludes our evil podcast. Enjoy!